Welcome to another show of things you didn't know about the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I'm very excited today. As you can see, I have three guests, but I have with me, I have Danny Spungen, who I will explain in a minute. When I first learned about Operation Bernhard, I couldn't believe that the Nazis would be so ruthless at manipulating the Bank of England. I have with me first Charlotte Kruger, who is the granddaughter of the Bernhard Kruger, who was the SS person in charge of Operation Bernhard. I have with me Debbie Walter, whose father was one of the survivors, forced labor survivors of this operation, and I have with me Danny Spungen, who's a collector of people and things. And as you can see, he collected these people. So we're going to talk about the history behind the book. But first, Charlotte, will you just tell us when did this start? Set the stage.
For me, it started obviously when I grew up as a child, and at some point found out that my grandfather was this big SS man. I learned it really after he died because when he was alive, I was too young to really understand what that meant. So one day, after a couple of years after my grandfather had died, and I was a young teenager. Um, my father came to us and said, I'm going to tell you today who your grandfather was. And he put all the files on the desk that he had, and he tried to present all the important information that he had um, as as objective as possible. And yeah, it was hard to digest, and it took me, my whole time growing up to really understand what he told us that day. And then one day in 2015, Danny Spungen, I got in touch with Danny Spungen for the first time because one of the things that I did to cope with the story of my grandfather was write a book and research everything, because at some point my father also died, so I couldn't ask him further. And then I went to all the archives and tried to piece together the story as good as I could. And one of the things I did was I meet one of the survivors of Operation Bernhard, Jack Plapla, in Berlin. And when he died, one of his friends asked me to inform somebody called Danny Spungen in Chicago of his death because they couldn't speak English. And then I wrote an email to Danny, and that's how we got in touch.
Uh, but what? Okay, that's a great origin story of meeting Danny. But what I meant was, let's take us back in history to 1940 something when your grandfather was put in charge of this operation.
So the story for him begins in 1942 when he's being put in charge. But of course, it started earlier in his biography because he joined the Nazi Party quite early, in I have to think 1934, I think. Oh God, it's 10 years ago that I wrote the book. I'm sorry, I should know this. So very quite early. He had quite a low number of NSDAP and also SS. And he joined the Secret Service of the NSD of the SS, which is called Sicherheitsdienst, SD. And he was recruited by Reinhard Heydrich himself, who was, yeah, you know who he was. He was one of the architects of the Holocaust. And he needed people who were able to handle radio because intelligence is all about radio transmissions and listening, and also propaganda, fake propaganda for Poland and stuff. So he did that for a while, and then he went to Berlin. And at some point in 1942, he was asked to had a secret mission, and the mission was to counterfeit the British pound, with the ultimate goal being at that point to destabilize the British economy. Never got to that point, and they found other uses for the money, but that was the initial idea. And in
And
order to do that, yeah,
Debbie, you want to
Yes.
chime in here and say, in order to do that,
Well, he had to find people who could either make money, who were artists, who had good eyesight, so they could be people who would be able to check over the work that was being done, and people who could maybe forge papers. And that's how my father got involved. He was with the resistance at a young age, and he was still a teenager, but he was making false papers for people and got caught one day and ended up in a concentration camp. So he was, I guess, lucky that this program came around, because actually he and his friend, another person who was part of Operation Bernhard, were in line to be gassed, and he talked his way out of it. And both he and Peter Adel, the other person who was an artist and was already a famous artist at the time, were sent back to the barracks. And then just a few days later, they were picked up for Operation Bernhard. So it saved him from going to the gas chamber.
Danny, you want to chime in here for a minute and just say how you got involved in the story?
Well, first, let me say that when Debbie did not mention her father was actually at Auschwitz. It was more than he was right there in line, and he did get very, very lucky to be sent to Sachsenhausen in Berlin for Operation Bernhard. So how I got involved is that I am a collector of people and things, and I have arguably the largest collection in the world of Holocaust artifacts in private hands, related to postal history, numismatics, passports, visas. And people told me that you can't see a face. There's no face on the money, the Operation Bernhard counterfeit money. You can't, it's just a piece of money. You can't see anybody behind it. I said, that's not true. There are Charlotte Kruger. There's Nazi people involved in making the money. There's 144 approximate Jews that were part of the operation. So we can put a face on this money. And then in 2008, by chance, through the German consulate employee, I found Debbie Walter. And I happened to be in Ohio, and one of my fellow collectors and I, we drove down to Mansfield, Ohio in 2008 to meet Hans Walter. And it was great. And from that moment on, I got to meet the last survivors of Operation Bernhard, Jack Flappler in Germany, Adolf Berger, who got the Academy Award, accolades for the movie The Counterfeiters. And then Robert Jan von Pelt, who's a very well-known architecture expert in Auschwitz, said, if you're going to make a book that really speaks, and it really speaks, it can tell a story, and that you can see the faces. That's how I got involved.
Okay, so let's pick it up from what was the story in effect? Whose idea was it to destabilize the Bank of England with currency?
All
Does anyone know? Or is it just one of those things that just someone got the bright idea and ran with it?
I don't know for really because I haven't seen proof. Some say it was my grandfather's predecessor at the and at the SD as head of the counterfeit unit, Alfred Naujoks. But I'm not sure if that's true. I don't think there's any proof that who really had the idea first within the Nazi establishment. So I don't really know. But it originated a bit earlier. It was not my grandfather's idea.
What our book says anyway is that, listen, before people today don't understand this, before the internet, people survived by writing letters and using paper, physical money, not this crypto stuff. And propaganda, they always counterfeit. The Allies made counterfeit stamps and counterfeit money. the Germans made counterfeit $1 bills and dropped it over Paris in October 1943. And they did have this idea, Operation Andres or Andrew, to counterfeit the Bank of England money to drop over England, saying, don't be afraid of us, we're good people. But then that fell apart. That whole operation fell apart. No one can keep a secret. And they said, let's make an operation where we can use Jews because we're going to murder them anyway. And this is basically the folklore that actually kind of fact. And Charlotte's grandfather was hired to run this operation. And he selected the 144 Jews, approximately 144 Jews, and to make this operation in Sachsenhausen. They put them in 2 barracks to counterfeit the Bank of England money. And to this day, it's the biggest counterfeiting scheme. Billions of dollars worth of pounds, British bank money pounds, was circulated throughout the world and used by the German government, the Nazi government, to buy ammunition, gold, just things they needed, paper. So it was actually a counterfeiting scheme. But Charlotte, you might want to correct me anywhere you want, no problem.
Debbie,
No corrections so far. No, thank you.
Debbie, tell us about those 2 barracks. Did they have special privileges? Did they get any more food?
I think they did have special privileges. The people that worked for Bernhard Kruger said pretty much that they knew what would happen after the war, but in the meantime, they did feel like he saved their lives. And they did give them privileges. They would somehow sneak in cigarettes, sneak in a little bit of extra food, not a lot, but they were able to put on plays in the barracks. My dad said that they did different kinds of things to entertain themselves that they were allowed to do that other prisoners were not allowed to do. And from what I remember, my dad saying like that those barracks were actually separated or fenced around, that they were the only ones that had access to it, and then whatever guards were watching them. But yeah, there was a lot of little extra things that were brought in, like cigarettes and other things that other prisoners wouldn't get.
Let's just
Debbie, real quick, is when the movie came out, the 2007 Academy Award movie, The Counterfeiters, it portrayed them as Jews having a choice. Do we counterfeit the money or not? No, you had no choice. You make the money or you die. And Charlotte's grandfather was actually very good. He wanted to survive as well. He wanted to make the program last as long as possible. And your father had a mattress. He had a pillow. After they sent the money to see to the Bank of England to make sure it's working, they say, hey, we got this money. Is it really real? And they said, yes. They got a ping pong table. So they had radio.
Yeah, they had lots of extra things.
Right. You want them to feel good. You want them they're artists. You want them to make this money perfect. You don't want to threaten them. So they had a lot of privileges.
Interesting. Just to remind us, our audience, Sachsenhausen, I believe, was opened in 1936. It is in Germany, so it's way before the war. And did it have crematorium?
No.
I don't think
No. Sachsenhausen was a model camp where you actually trained the guards to go throughout the system.
That's what
Sachsenhausen had different factories to rebuild watches. When they confiscated Jewish property, their watches, their gold, their silverware, everything was sent to Sachsenhausen and redistribution. It was like a distribution warehouse. And they trained the guards there. And yes, it was one of the earliest camps. Oranienburg was what they call the wild camp. They shut that down and made Sachsenhausen.
Interesting.
I think it did have a crematorium, but it is true that it wasn't one of those Vernichtungslager. It wasn't a death camp.
Right.
It was what they had at first, like mainly political prisoners, social democrats, and then so some Jews came in later, I think, around Reichskristallnacht. I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, so it was different from Auschwitz. It was not a death camp. And regarding the privileges, I mean, that's the thing that my whole family is trying to figure out about my grandfather, because it is true that he made sure that the Jewish prisoners were treated in a way that they would be able to do this work, which was not something you could beat somebody to do, because it needed a lot of focus, concentration, quiet. It needed to be precise. And I think my grandfather was quite smart at how to manipulate people into doing his will. So it was a scheme, right? So it was, he tried to give them hope, like, I'm going to take care of you, you're going to survive this, because without hope they wouldn't function in the way that he needed them to function. I think that was the rationale behind this. I mean, he didn't write it down like that, and he certainly didn't say that to the prosecutors later, but I think that's the logic behind this, because, and I have to correct myself, earlier, he actually joined the party before Hitler came to power. He joined in 1931. That's why he had a low number. I'm sorry I got that wrong before. I just had a work day and had my mind somewhere else. So he was a Nazi early on. So there's no way denying that. And since he went to Auschwitz to get more prisoners for his operation, he knew what was going on. He knew full scale. He even went to the Eastern Front in 1941, when after the attack on the Soviet Union. And he was at all the places, because he had, I found a map where he had put all the places where he went in his car and at the Eastern Front. And he happened to have been to all the places where the so-called Einsatzgruppen were butchering people and mass murdering, and all those shootings that were in also protocoled in detail. That's why we know all the dates and what happened where, because they wired it back to Berlin. So he knew it all, I think. And so there's no way of, yeah, that's
Of
the
whitewashing
you
his
know.
role, we might
No,
say, right?
no, I think not. Even though I'm glad that almost all of them survived, which is also kind of due to what he did. I don't want to say he saved him, but he did make sure that they lived long enough to be liberated. So in that case, I'm glad, because otherwise I would have been the granddaughter of a mass murder, right? So yeah.
I just want to clarify, you're not saying that he was part of the Einsatzgruppen, though, are you?
No, no, no. No, that was not his job. He had a job. His job was to collect identity cards from captured soldiers and from people, because they wanted to make fake identity cards for agents to be then dropped behind enemy lines as agent provocateur, like
Yeah.
to put sabotage. Really, really deadly mission to do that. But that was his job. He did that both in France and in the Soviet Union. There's good reason to believe that this is really true, because there's proof. So no, he wasn't one of those trigger pullers in the Einsatzgruppe.
And Debbie, tell us a little bit more about where your father was coming from when he got caught.
Um, well, early in his school years, he didn't really like school, but he found out he was good at forging things. So when he had bad grades, he would change the grades and forge his parents' signatures on the return, like when they had to return the report card and things like that, and started doing things like that in like school, where he would change friends' report cards and sign their parents' name with like, if he could look at it, he would forge their names. And it just progressed into being able to forge papers for other Jewish people trying to get out of Berlin. As he was living
Oh,
in Berlin,
okay. So wait, that's what I wanted to know. So he was a German Jew.
Yes, a German Jew living in Berlin. Um, both parents were Jewish, but he was being raised by his stepfather who was Catholic. So, but he was, unlike his other siblings, he was actively involved in the resistance. So he got picked up, fell asleep on the train one day, supposedly after a night out, and was
And
picked up.
do you know when this was?
It was just before Operation Bernhard started. He wasn't in the camps long before that. So,
Okay. Danny, do you have anything to add at this point in the story?
Well, what's interesting about this story is that there's been a lot of rumors, a lot of the money was used to uh, capture or we get when Mussolini was kidnapped. They were going to use the money to release Mussolini. That's not true. So there's a lot, the movie had a lot of inaccuracies, and the story itself had so many inaccuracies. So what we decided to do is, am I still there? Oh
Yes.
yeah, I'm sorry, good. I lost connection. And so what happened was we needed to make this story whole. So when Charlotte, who really did some deep research into making things right, that helped a lot. And she wrote a book called My Grandfather the Counterfeiter, but it was only in German, and they would not publish it in English. And so that's when we decided to make a book. I'll just show you what it looks like. I
Yes,
know
please.
people can't see it. So this is Robert Jan van Pelt, who's pretty famous. He said, you gotta make a die cut center. So we have a hole in the book because we want to make it interactive. And then inside the book, there's 2 plastic sleeves, museum quality sleeves, and you can put your own Operation Bernhard counterfeit note. This is what a note looks like. Believe it or not, money was this big. It was this big back in the day. I mean, it's kind of crazy. This is a Bernhard note. And this is a Bank of England real note. So it's unbelievable. There's 10,000 things they did right, but maybe 13 to 15 things that went wrong. They made a few mistakes in the watermark, very few. When I met Hans Walter in 2008, I said, Hans, we could take a real Bank of England note, look at an Operation Bernhard note, and we can tell the difference in 5 seconds. And he was angry. I met him in his home, his little 85-year-old man, maybe he's 90 by then, I don't know. And he was shaking the table. No, if you could tell it's a counterfeit, I wouldn't be here today. And I said, oh, wait a minute. It's today's technology we're able to figure things out. But back then it was impossible because Hans's job was there was 5 stages of proofing, of verification that a counterfeit is a perfect counterfeit. And he was the last stage. He was stage 5. Is that right, Debbie?
I think so. Yeah, he was young enough. He still had good eyesight, so everything kind of went past these 5 people, and he was like pretty much the last one that said whether he thought it was good enough or not, even though he was so
But
young.
Debbie, tell Phyllis, how did your father feel about Bernhard Kruger during the operation and then after the war?
When he actually started talking about him as not just a Holocaust, because he would always talk to us about the Holocaust and things, but never about any of the real, like the guards or the SS or anything that he encountered until later on. So by that time, stories started switching around. But for the most part, he thought that, I mean, I think he knew, once this operation was over, they were going to be killed because they're going to tie up loose ends. But I think he felt that, I don't know if he felt if he was being manipulated or if he just was being given privileges so his life would be better while he was working, because he knew they were going to kill him.
So wait,
If they weren't liberated in time, he knew that eventually they would kill them.
but Operation Bernhard was still going on in
Mhm.
May of 45. They were still cranking out the money.
Um, I don't actually know if they were cranking out the money, but they were in Bad Ischl. And when they were liberated, that camp pretty much just opened their doors. And my dad walked out and just started walking. He was at Ebensee and started walking toward Bad Ischl and ended up being picked up usually it's by an American Jeep. Sometimes it's a Russian and then they take him to the Americans. But he just got picked up, taken to a hospital in Bad Ischl, and just walked out. And he said they just opened the gates and we could all walk if we could.
But Charlotte, is it true, Charlotte, that your grandfather, to keep the operation going as long as possible, that he said, let's counterfeit the $100 bill? And then right when it was like in the January, February of 45 or March, let's close this thing down and move it to Bad Ischl, Austria. Is that correct? You want to fill in the blanks there a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, I hope I'm not wrong again, February 1945, Sachsenhausen closed down and everybody had to leave. And my grandfather said, I still need my operation to go on because I'm gonna finally crack dollar, the dollar bill, which is what he did, what he was trying to do. Whether he really believed if he was able to do the dollar or not is subject to debate. I personally believe he didn't think he could do it with the technology that he had at hand because he had the wrong machines. But he wanted his superiors to believe because at some point, lots of his colleagues were being sent to the Eastern Front. And in the last weeks and months of the war, it was about surviving and not being sent to the Eastern Front. Nobody wanted to go there in the end and with, well, maybe not nobody, but I think my grandfather was one of those who didn't want, and he had the two young children, and he wanted to stay in Berlin. And this operation kept him in Berlin. And so he convinced his superiors that he still needs his counterfeit unit. So he made sure that they were transferred to the south of Germany to another secret camp. And there, at some point, it's a complicated story, but bottom line is he got some kind of order from Berlin in the end to then, stop the production and everything and destroy all the rest of the banknotes. So he packed it all in three big trucks, which are then heading south and some of them ended up in the Toplitzsee, which is why we have all those notes still being sold in the internet because they all were dropped or lots of them were dropped at Toplitzsee and later recovered. So what happens to my grandfather and how does he make sure that those still 140 Jews would be liberated? Well, he can't. But what he did is he said, everybody, this is the end, and you're going. And there are lots of different reports from the survivors, like what were his last words, and he did give a speech to them. that I can tell, and I think most point to him saying, you're going to get liberated soon. But still, he ordered his soldiers to bring all the prisoners to Ebensee camp. And at Ebensee, they could have gotten killed in the very last moment. But the Americans arrived soon enough to liberate. So it was luck in the end. So I think my grandfather did what he could to prolong their chance, because that was his chance as well. So their fates were kind of connected at that point. But then in the very end, he left them and he said to his soldiers, like, they have to go to the camp and then you can go. From today, from this nice little office where I'm sitting here, you could ask yourself, why didn't he just say go? Why did he say bring them to Ebensee? Maybe, but I really don't know. I can't say. I think he was very loyal, and if he had the orders to bring them to Ebensee, then he did so. But that way he risked them being killed in a way, because there's also all the survivors. I don't know, Debbie. Maybe Hans also told what happened in Ebensee at the very last moment. Maybe you want to tell that story.
At least to me, I don't remember him saying anything about being, near the crematorium there or anything like that. Um, what he's always just told us was that was where he was liberated. I don't think they were there very long before the Americans, and possibly some Russians as well, came and liberated the camp. But the only time he really talked about like being close to a gas chamber or something like that was when he first entered and was in Auschwitz. So I don't know if they just hadn't gotten to Operation Bernhard prisoners yet, any of them say, or like you said, they just got lucky and the Americans were there within days or weeks and were able to liberate the camp, and he just left.
Wait, let's clarify something. Abency had gas chambers.
I
I
don't,
don't
I
know.
don't,
My
I don't
dad
know.
never talked about that. So that's why, I mean, if they were going to do something there, I don't know if it was related to a gas chamber. Um, I think
You're
there
gonna
was,
blow up the cave. The caves. That's Evansville where they made aircraft parts in the caves.
Mm.
And they
Oh,
were gonna put all the Jews in caves and just
and
blow up the caves. That was the plan. And they knew it. And so they resisted a little bit at the end. And by that time, the German soldiers, the Nazi soldiers, they left. They just ran away.
so I
yeah,
really, because, okay, the name Abency sounded a little familiar. So that's how they were going to get rid of those prisoners. Okay, I see.
Right.
And so what happened to your father after the war? You mentioned the word prosecutors, Charlotte.
After the war, he hid himself for a while, because he knew he was being that the British wanted to arrest him. But after a while, they put some pressure on my grandmother because they assumed that she would know where he was, which was true. And then he turned himself in 1946, I think. And then he was in British custody for a while. Then they handed him over to the French because of what my grandfather had done in France. They also wanted to prosecute him. And then he was relieved after, I think, 1.5 years, some point in 1947, I think, or early 1948. I don't have all the dates in my mind. But so he was never prosecuted by the French for war crimes. But I couldn't get the whole file. The French archives only gave me parts of it, so I don't really know what was going on there. But they didn't prosecute him in the end. And after that, when he came out, there was this thing called denazification court. And so he was denazified, and they categorized him as a Mitläufer, so which was a very low category. Like, there were these like number one were the Nuremberg, number two, number three, and then comes number four. That's what my grandfather was categorized. It was really low. It was like he he told the story so well that I think people believed him or wanted to believe him, or maybe they were still Nazis, or he got away with it. And that infuriated one of the former prisoners later, because this is quite a sad story, actually, quite a disturbing story. I'm going to try to make it short. So one of the prisoners who was liberated, together with Jackie Plapla, the survivor whom I knew, one of his friends, Georg Kohn, he was later arrested by Soviet soldiers, and the Soviet had used Sachsenhausen as an internment camp after the liberation of the concentration camp. So this poor man was first at Operation Bernhard in Sachsenhausen, and later again by the Soviets for reasons. He wanted to go back to his house, and then they said, I think he was not very diplomatic when he tried to get back to his house in Poland, and then they assumed he was some capitalist or whatever. They somehow made a case around him. It was very unfair and unjust. And then when he came out and he heard, after he had sat there twice, that my grandfather was living somewhere, having a job, he was angry and he tried to sue my grandfather for murder. And that's where another court case was done. So there are a couple of court cases. And he was not charged for murder either, even though 6 of the prisoners were killed and or died. It's a bit unclear, the situation, because they were sick with tuberculosis. And then some of them were shot, maybe all of them. It's not entirely clear, because if they had stayed in the camp, they might have infected the others with tuberculosis. But they also couldn't be sent within the logic of the concentration camp. They couldn't be sent to the hospital there. I don't know the English word. The barracks for where patients were treated, because they were the bearers of a state secret. So they were shot in that instead. And my grandfather had to explain that situation in court, but then they decided it didn't even come to court case. It was just an police investigation, and then it never came to court case because the state attorney didn't see that the evidence was strong enough.
And Debbie,
which tells you something about how justice was in the 1950s in Germany, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that I know a great deal about. Well,
yeah.
Debbie, so how does your father feel afterwards? Did he ever say anything about Charlotte's grandfather?
Not really. I mean, sometimes when he talked about it, he just talked about the privileges that they were given because he was working for Bernhard Kruger, but he never really went into depth about him. He basically just talked about a couple of people who were friends that survived, that they stayed in touch. He stayed in touch with Peter Adel and with Jack Poplar. There were visits and letters that were sent back and forth after the war, but he never really talked in depth about any of the guards or the SS or Bernhard Kruger in general. It was just about his experience living in the barracks and doing what he knew he had to do to survive or try to survive.
But Debbie, your father was involved in a court case filed in America accusing Bernhard Kruger of murder. But I think you said later on he just did that because he wanted to get medical attention in America or something like that.
He may have, because I think that case actually happened before I was born. So, and like I said, as he got older, his stories started changing, which happens. But there was a court case. I remember him saying something when I was really young, that there was a court case going on. And he just said it had to do with World War II, with the Holocaust, Nazis. And that might be all he actually told us at the time because of our age. But that was something that was never hidden from us ever since we were young and going to temple and stuff. We knew that he was a Holocaust survivor. And I think it wasn't until I was a little bit older when he explained Operation Bernhard and stuff. And that's what he was doing when he was actually in the camps and things like that.
Hey, Phyllis, I know we only have a couple minutes. Can I just kind of like help tie this up a tiny bit?
Yes, absolutely.
Charlotte is amazing and Debbie's amazing. They've never met in person. So you have the granddaughter of the Nazi in charge of the operation, and you have the daughter of the survivor, the prisoner of Operation Bernhard. They've never met in person. So what we're doing, our foundation, we're going to bring him and have a USA tour of them meeting for the first time in person, because we didn't have enough time, but they both have messages. Like, why would Charlotte, that'll be like a cliffhanger. Why would Charlotte expose her grandfather? What's her message to students? What's her message to fellow German people her age, why they should investigate their history? Maybe not all for bad things either. And then why is Debbie tell the story? And why did Hans speak out and speak so much where other survivors did not? And what's amazing, so we're going to bring them together. And our book, by the way, it is called Forging Secrets, Faces and Facts. behind Operation Bernhard. Comes to the Great Slipcase, everything. And the story's growing. It's not ending because we just found a postcard in our collection, and it was sent from the Łódź Ghetto. And in the Łódź Ghetto,
Wait,
the
wait.
address
We
is
say
from
Ludge in this. We say Ludge on this show. Go ahead.
okay, yeah, no problem. I never know how to say that word, but anyway, from the ghetto, and it was from the address of a man who ends up in Operation Bernhard, who then ends up in New York City with another Operation Bernhard survivor, and they open up a print shop in New York City. And we just found the grandson of another Operation Bernhard survivor. He's a professor at Duke University, and he's researching his grandfather. So the story keeps on going. And then we found the grandson in South Africa of a man whose grandfather was in charge of the whole distribution network of the money. So the story keeps on growing. And I'm wearing this crazy hat, by the way, because in 2009, I took survivors, Sam Harris from Illinois, to Lake Topolsky. And this is a hat from that lake, because in 1959, they dug up a lot of the money. They went into the lake and they recovered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of this fake money. So the story keeps on growing, but there's a message. And that's what the book talks about, is that there's a section for everybody. Those who like the counterfeits, those who want to read about why would Charlotte do this, write a story about her grandfather. What's the message? And Debbie wrote a chapter about her life. And they've never met. So we're very excited that hopefully within the next 12 months, for sure, we're going to put them on tour in America. It's very exciting.
It is very exciting. And Danny, I think we should take 1 minute, few minutes. Can you make it really short? Your origin story of how you got into this. It was a whole bus ride to the Anne Frank Museum in South Carolina, which I heard this story. But how about just the highlights?
Well, thank God my mother passed away. I love her, but she hates this story. My ACT and SAT scores, my college exam scores were pathetically low. It's so low I won't even put them on film right now, but I tell everybody verbally. And I became a collector of stamps and coins. And as a kid, that's how I learned. As you can tell, I'm very passionate. I've never been drugged. If I was born today, they put me on Ritalin or whatever they would do, it hook me up to a machine. I'm very, very passionate, and I learned quickly through short stories. I learned through stamps. But stamp collectors don't get married. Fast forward, I got married. I finally started collecting again, and I got involved with our foundation. Our foundation, the Florence and Lawrence Spung and Family Foundation, is mostly for cancer back in the day. And I said, well, the Holocaust is a cancer. It's a breakdown in DNA. Take this collection that I bought and let's put it in the foundation. And that's how I got involved in this story, because I'm just not a great reader. I've never read my book, by the way, cover to cover. I read sections of it. So I'm just a collector, and I like bringing people together. And I think Charlotte and Debbie and these other grandchildren that we're finding, they're fascinating, and they are their future messengers. They are the messengers of the story, because Holocaust survivors are, sadly, they're just passing away very quickly.
And do you take I mean, Danny has taken his exhibit to when I did a program in Elgin, Illinois, a couple of years ago, which is my hometown. I thought I would never go back, and then I turned out I did. He takes his exhibits around the world. He loans out these.
Exhibits have been to China, Nanjing, University of Nanjing. It's been to Greece, Netherlands, Belgium. We want students to hold witnesses. These are witnesses. These survived the Holocaust. And I love museums. Believe me, I love museums, but it's all behind the case. The text is hard to read. We want students to pick up original artifacts. I know we're taking away life, but we want them to feel it. Usually it's protected in nice plastic, like the money. It's in plastic so people can't ruin it. But the idea is that we want students to have a relationship with the artifacts. And that's why you could put a face on this money. And that's why we have Charlotte as a witness to tell the story of her grandfather. We have Debbie telling the story of her father. So this is what we're doing. This is what we would love to do.
And I just think, I think Danny's amazing that he's done all this and collected all these people and put all these things together. And the
You too,
world,
Phyllis. You're part of my collection. You're part of my collection.
I know. So I was going to say something about your mother, but that's okay. I'm just saying her loss is our gain in terms of what you've accomplished in your life. And I actually kind of wanted for you to tell a little bit of that story of when this collection first came into your hands and you thought you were going to sell it and then you piecemeal and then you realized what a treasure you had.
In 2007, I went to a stamp show and I wanted to buy the inverted Jenny, the most rarest USA stamp. It's upside down airplane. And we were haggling over the price. And I went back to the stamp show. I saw this man with a piece of Jewish scripture, a piece of Torah, ripped apart with Nazi cancellation. This is on a piece of Torah, scripture. And I was stunned. I knew nothing about the Holocaust. I have no relatives that we know of that were part of the Holocaust, but I knew I can make money. That I used to sell stamps and coins at Marshall Fields. I sold every grandma the Walt Disney stamps. I could sell a piece of the Holocaust. All these grandparents who have these 13-year-old kids being bar mitzvah. And then I had this big celebration of buying this collection. I competed against a lot of museums to get this collection. And I never sold anything. I met Sam Harris, a Holocaust survivor, and you should become a docent. I said, oh, I don't even know what a docent is. And next thing, one thing led to another, and now it's a great traveling exhibit. But we're just the appetizer. The real main course, the main deal, the keynote speakers, that's the Charlotte, Debbie, the Holocaust survivors that still travel with us. And that's what we're trying to do.
Well, you've done it in spades, and I highly encourage people who have the chance to see this exhibit in person. I mean, I've touched the things and in plastic, and I know how important this is for teenagers, especially to say, this is the real thing. This is Emmett. I was going to say truth, Emmett. So I just really want to say thank you again for all of you for coming on the show and sharing your story, sharing the warts and the bright lights of survival. And I just want to say thank you to my listeners. But I do have to end on a solemn message, which is in the memory of uh, those who didn't survive and who tried to save them be a blessing forever.
Thank you.